following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
So I don't have to do all the same plumbing, because I was like, it's either I have to build this thing or someone already thought of this problem and they built it. So that's how I ran into what the graph is all about.
GRTiQ Podcast.
We're like astronauts, floating in the space of time, lost between past and future.
Welcome to the GRTiQ Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Saihajpreet Singh, software engineer at the Guild. Anyone already familiar with the Graph ecosystem knows that the Guild is one of the core dev teams working to build the Graph. I hosted the CEO of the Guild, Uri Goldshtein, during episode 50. Today's interview is a GRTiQ Podcast first. Saihaj is the first guest I've interviewed who is currently completing his education at university. As longtime listeners know, I'm very curious about what universities are teaching about blockchain and Web3, and so Saihaj provides an interesting glimpse into that. During this interview, Saihaj also shares his personal story and journey into Web3, his contributions to the GraphQL community, going to work at the Guild, and what he and the team are contributing to the Graph. Along the way, Saihaj will educate us about the differences between GraphQL, Rust, and Solidity, his interest in and vision for the future of NFTs, and the recent GraphQL Conference 2023 in San Francisco, where the Graph had a very strong presence. We started the discussion talking about when Saihaj first became interested in technology.
I worked computers since I was a kid. As a kid, I was helping my dad build computers with him, and then I would go to his office, check out the server room. I learned coding at a very young age. I think I was in 4th grade when I learned about HTML and JavaScript. My website would run on my dad's computer. That was big achievement for me. And then later on, I learned about Python. I learned machine learning. I did a course before, this is all during high school and stuff before that. Now I'm studying computer science at Carleton University. This is my last semester, so I should graduate next summer. So I'm pretty excited to, graduate and work in the space.
So Saihaj, this is the first time I've had the opportunity to interview somebody that's actually still in university. So I'm excited to ask some questions about that. And before I ask you some of that, I do want to ask about your interest in technology at such a young age. I mean, you were helping build computers and learning code. Do you remember what it was about technology or these types of things that drew your interest at such a young age?
I think for me, it was I started playing video games and stuff. And then I was always curious, how was this thing working? Or I was drawing on MS Paint because MS Paint was still a big thing back in the day. So it was okay, how does my mouse work with my computer? That kind of thing always, mouse itself is a biggest innovation, I would say. How you can just click around on it, scroll around it, it just works. And then I was just trying to, explore and learn things. And then my dad would teach me hey, you connect this thing so this works. Then I would learn about how printers work. And then I would learn printer's a really cool thing. I can type something or I can draw and it can print things out. So I think that's just curiosity just got me into how can I make my own web page? And then here we are doing coding full time now.
As I've interviewed so many people and learned about their background, it's always a parent or a mentor introducing them at a young age to technology. In this case, it was your father. And then this idea of building and taking apart computers is another pretty common theme. It seems like everybody that got into computer science and eventually went to work in tech had an early interest in building and taking apart. So does that check the box for you? Were you building and taking apart computers and playing around?
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? What is it about building it and taking it apart? What's that extra step of wanting to take it apart and put it back together?
I may not even know the answer because if you ask my parents, I know if I had a screwdriver, I would open all my toys up. I was just like always the kid who will like open things up. So I was just like, okay, I want to see what's inside. So from my remote control cars, I would take like the motors out, and I would just try to build something. So for me, it's always just like, oh, now it's a big thing that you can open apart and see what's inside it.
I love it. Well, I appreciate you sharing some of that background. And as I said a moment ago, you're still in university, you're studying computer science. Talk to us about what you're studying in computer science. And again, longtime listeners of the podcast know I've been trying to track a little bit through guest interviews when things like blockchain and Web3 and these types of topics are making their way into university. And so I want to take advantage of the opportunity to speak into somebody that's studying computer science in real time presently. Are you being exposed to these things? And if so, in what context?
Yeah, so I took a course last winter, actually. So it's in university. I think this is an advanced course that they teach. It's like cryptography. So they talk about cryptography and like how public ledgers work. So we go into we learn about like Ethereum and how Bitcoin work, because they're like, the big examples of like public ledgers and like how consensus methods work. So they use blockchains as an example for cryptography on like how the data is stored actually on the blockchain, or like, in Ethereum, like your accounts, like how Ethereum addresses work, or like all that kind of stuff. But I think most of this is covered in like advanced. It's in my senior year, so that's when they're covering it. But like early on, you're not really exposed too much to like Web3 or blockchains in general. I think most people who kind of get curious about any of this is like hackathons. I think hackathons are a great place where like, I recall like in my first year, there were like some hackathons I saw where like people are talking about like, blockchains and like what you could actually build with the blockchains. But then those were like more proprietary, like they were not like public blockchains, but like I think you kind of get the idea of like, hey, this is a blockchain. These are things you can do. And taking it to like Web3, you can explore like more opportunities there.
As you have conversations with other students or take part in conversations in this course you just described, do you get the sense that the next generation is being pulled in the direction of Web3 and blockchain and public ledgers? I mean, do you think there's interest in younger people pursuing this industry?
I think, yeah. So there's like a lot of interest in people. Like, I think like generally people who take these cryptography courses are, excited about learning cryptography in like real world use cases. And then the biggest example these days is actually, I think, Ethereum or like, Bitcoin kind of thing. Because Bitcoin was the era of like 2008 to like, like that was like the starting period for Bitcoin. But like most of the mathematics behind how Bitcoin works or like how these blockchains work is like, these courses have been there for like ages, but then you see like these public blockchains as a good example of like those theoretical things. So I think a lot of people interested in these are like usually like very interested in like how the math part works. And then some people end up like, exploring what can we build. So I think there's like a lot more, like my professor, he's also like, very into like all this cryptography stuff. He was also like, he would like give us examples of like NFTs and like what other things people are actually building on like public ledgers. So that's pretty cool. And then I think the other part, I think we also talked about like DEXs, but we didn't touch too much on like how DEXs work. But I think there were like few examples shared in the courses about like DEXs and NFT projects.
Well, we're talking today because you work at the Guild, and we're going to double click a ton on the Guild and the things you've been contributing there. But I have to ask, so here you are, you're in this course, you're getting done with the university, and you're working in Web3, you're working in cryptography. Is that fun for you to be in a course like that where you can kind of say, I'm actually doing this, I have real world experience with some of these things?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty fun and exciting thing. But then, like schools have like I think our education systems are not, as developed. Like they still want you to go through like the old process of like tests and all that. But like, so some most real world things actually don't translate one to one. But I think it's like, having conversations with other peers or like just professors. It's a fun thing. And like, they're also curious, like what you're doing.
When you started university, what was your vision for what you wanted to do with your degree in computer science? What was the early vision?
In my high school, we had like this program. I was in like a cybersecurity program where my school would like pair with professionals in the industry. So I was like learning about like cybersecurity, like, how security works and like, organization. So people don't get to a server closet or some things like that, but also like on the network, like when you connect to a network or like logging in or like connecting to a Wi-Fi. So I think I was pretty curious learning like all this kind of stuff about like how security works in general. So I thought like it would be cool to learn like more about security. So I decided to, do computer science degree with like internet security. And then one thing I learned during that whole process was like, how do you actually build systems that are secure? And then I think that's one thing we touch a lot in Web3 is like, how do you build like, safe protocols or like secure protocols?
So do you remember when you first became aware of crypto? You got started in tech super early. You're presently studying computer science in university. When does crypto come into the picture here?
Crypto comes into the picture around 2021, I would say. Like I'm in my second year of university. It's the summer when COVID hit, things are in lockdown and stuff. So how it all started was like in that summer, my friends introduced me to NBA Top Shot. It was just getting started. And then so we traded cards. We all made some profit. So then I was kind of curious like how all this thing works. Cause like, we all played with like Pokemon cards back in the day. And then NBA Top Shot was like a digital version of that. So I was kind of curious like how all this is working. So that's where we found out about like how NFTs work and like, the whole ecosystem of like what we see today, people talking about things. So yeah, my experience to crypto was like just trading NFT cards, but then me and my friend ended up learning Solidity, and then you started building like side projects and like, just how ERC 721 works. And then one thing I quickly realized was like building a dApp with JSON RPCs was quite slow. And then other thing was like the developer experience was just pretty bad. If I'm thinking like, how do you build like an actual real scale app that could compete with other big apps in the industry today? That kind of intrigued me. I was already big into the GraphQL ecosystem. Like GraphQL is just the language to query APIs. So I was like, what if you could just have a GraphQL API to read my NFT project? And then that's where I learned about the graph.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at the Graph.Foundation. That's the Graph.Foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
I think you're the second guest, Saihaj, that came into the crypto space by virtue of interest in NFTs. And so it's not an incredibly common thing, although I guess if we put the timeline into context, NFTs were certainly a big deal around the time that you became exposed to crypto. What are your thoughts about the future of NFTs? As somebody that came into the industry by virtue of NFTs, this is quite debated right now, right? I mean, a lot of people are arguing that NFTs are dead. So where do you come in on this debate?
I think the NFT debate, like when I got into it, right, like I think Bored Apes and CryptoPunks were like really big thing. And then we saw like, even after that, like Bored Apes just moved a lot. Like, a lot of people just got rid of Bored Apes. I think if you think about like what artists are getting paid, before that, like not many artists were actually getting paid. If you just put around like, the Ponzi schemes around how NFT projects launched NFTs, and then just think about like the impact it made on other people's lives. Because I've seen like many projects where like artists were actually artists are getting paid right away. And then if you think about it, like the biggest paintings that we see today that have like a very, high value to that art are just like, they're probably valued way a long time after the actual artist died. But today you can actually see these guys getting paid. I think that's like a pretty big thing. And then in terms of like what people can do with crypto, I think there's like a lot more things that can be explored around how NFTs work. I think like in the music space, we see like, NFTs at like, artist or something. Like if you're collecting NFTs from an artist or like a song or something, you can get like, tickets to a concert. I think that's a pretty good thing. Because if you think about like how concerts work, let's use Taylor Swift's concert as an example here. If you want to get a Taylor Swift ticket, you can't easily buy it. It's too expensive, or it's like already bought it by a botter. These are centralized platforms. There's no regulation around all this stuff. But then if you bring an NFT in a place, let's say people have an NFT of a Taylor Swift concert, Taylor Swift song, and then Taylor Swift is like, I'm going to give these holders access to collect my NFTs first because they, collected it. Then you can find a value of like, hey, I own this thing. I can actually buy that ticket. I'm part of the pre-sale. Because today how Ticketmaster pre-sale codes work, you just put a code and then you get access. There's nothing validating it. But with the NFT, I can actually validate that, hey, I own this thing. So I think there's a whole big space around like ownership of NFTs that you can build like a lot of products on. So that's where I see like this whole space moving towards.
And I think most people have held that position. I think that's kind of the fundamental position of NFTs, that it was a lot less about the hype and more about ownership. So a lot more to come on this particular topic. When was the point that you made the leap from NFTs are kind of cool when it comes to collectibles and trading cards to understanding that this whole Web3 industry was actually new tech or built on certain type of tech? When did that point come? Was there a specific moment or experience?
So as I was exploring things in my just writing Solidity and just putting like I should have a dApp on my GitHub, like my first dApp where you can just connect your wallet and say hi to me. And then I think around that time, I'm like, there are so many things happening when you're trying to say hi to someone. How does this wallet work? Like, what is even a wallet? Like, how does that wallet connect, right? So there are like a lot of moving pieces around all this. But then the other part is like, this code kind of, like if you think about a Solidity smart contract, this code is running somewhere and you're paying for like actually, doing something to that smart contract. Because traditionally what we were used to is like, if you go to a website, you load the web page, you're not really running any compute. It's the person, offering that web page to you, running all that for you. But now the kind of the shift is like, you kind of pay, like, the gas fee part is like, you are paying for like, if you need that kind of service. That's where I kind of got interested in like, what other things happen? Like, how does it actually happen? Because, in university, I did like a course on compilers and stuff. So I was kind of curious, like how Solidity was actually working and then how they would, compile code, run the whole EVM execution. So I read a lot about like how execution works in general. Just exploring my NFT project got me to just reading a lot more about it.
And so what's the backstory for how you became interested in GraphQL and became a member of that community?
So it was like, the summer after my first year, university shut down because of COVID. I got back home and then I was just like, what else can I do? I was kind of bored of playing video games and everything. I just didn't have anything to do, right? I think that was like normally with everyone, like, what can you do? You can't really leave your house. Like my dad wanted me to figure out something for him. So I got into like one open source project and then I was just helping them, edit the docs and do things. And then I kind of started reading into like how open source works in general. And then open source got me to like, just reading about like how Linux is just like an open operating system anyone can use. Most of the world runs on the software and like it's free to use. That was like, mind-blowing moment for me. And then I was like, okay, what can I do? And then, make a change. And then I kind of learned about GraphQL. Like I was learning about APIs and like how to build APIs and all that. And then when I was building my simple apps, I kind of saw, simple things that everyone was trying to solve. And then I started reading into like, okay, like what if I just want this thing? Like how can I build like, validations into my API and all that kind of stuff. Then I kind of got into like a GraphQL's website. And then I was like, oh, this is an open source project. Let me contribute to their docs. So I started contributing to the docs. I got into like, okay, get in touch with other maintainers of the project. I saw there was like an open issue to help migrate GraphQL.js from JavaScript to TypeScript. I was like, okay, at this time I'm learning how to write TypeScript. It's a cool project for me to take on. It's a fun challenge. So that's where I kind of got into GraphQL, like, part of the core team and stuff. Yeah, so it was just like me wandering around on the internet, and one day pop into GraphQL's issue board.
Saihaj, as you know, and certainly listeners know at this point, I'm not technical, so I actually don't know how to code. And you're talking about a lot of different coding languages. You're talking about Solidity. You've talked about GraphQL and a couple of these different things. If you don't mind, just providing a very base level introduction, how do these things relate to each other? And which ones should listeners who want to get involved, which one should they start with?
So Solidity is the language of it's one of the languages that you can write smart contracts on Ethereum. So if you're interacting with any block, NFT or like a token, it's probably written in like Solidity. Like most of them, what you interact with are written in Solidity. So that's like the language for writing smart contracts. GraphQL is a query language. It's more of a language for reading data or like interacting with the data that you have to offer. Under the hood, you can actually call a smart contract to read data, and GraphQL can be the language to read. It's kind of interface you can build for your own system. So you can, interact with the database. You can do a lot of things. So GraphQL is kind of like a higher level language. It's just for seeing what is possible with your APIs. And then JavaScript is language for the web browser. So if you're interacting with any website, most of the websites use JavaScript. I think if you're learning how to code, I think JavaScript is a very good place to start how to actually code. And then eventually, if you're into smart contracts and stuff, I think Solidity is the language to learn how to write smart contracts.
And how does JSON RPC and something like SQL fit into everything you just provided there, which was a great introduction, by the way.
Yeah. So how JSON RPCs work? So when I'm using Ethereum because I know a lot about Ethereum. So the way you interact with the Ethereum blockchain, there's this RPC API that's in a JSON format. JSON is nothing but a format of how you transport the data. So RPC is different methods and ways we can call on the Ethereum blockchain. If you're making calls, let's say you connect your wallet, right? And when you connect your wallet to some dApp, you're actually making JSON RPC calls to the Ethereum blockchain node. Let's say you're trying to transfer NFTs. So you're contacting with a JSON RPC method to a Ethereum blockchain, where the blockchain node will validate, hey, this person sent me a transaction. They will confirm it, and then they will send a response back. So you get the data oh, this NFT is transferred to this person now. So JSON RPCs come a lot, and how this whole Web3 space works, just reading data from the blockchain to and from the blockchain. And then SQL is for databases. So if you're trying to write, how can we read data? That's what we do at the Graph is indexing different blockchains. So what we're doing is reading data from different JSON RPCs, storing them in a database, and then SQL is the language that we use to read that data. And then on top of that, to top it all off, with GraphQL, that's what's happening when you're writing a GraphQL query. We're translating that to a SQL query, and that's how you're reading the data on the graph.
And let's just do one more that's pretty popular. And again, thank you for indulging me. But what about Rust? How does Rust fit into all of this?
Yeah, so Rust and Solidity are two different worlds we're talking. Solidity is just this language that most people in the web, building smart contracts deal with. Rust is a language we're talking about building systems that if you're talking about let's say Ethereum nodes that are running, there are projects that are building Ethereum nodes using Rust. So Rust is a very it's a low level kind of language that's used by many projects. Even at the Graph, the GraphQL APIs you're contacting, all those things are actually written in Rust. So we're building GraphQL APIs, we're writing Rust code that lets you interact with the blockchain data. So yeah, there's a lot of languages that you deal with every single day. There are many terms.
How then should someone like myself and listeners that are like me understand the different languages? Why isn't there just one? Why isn't there just one way to kind of do all of this? But yet it seems like there's so many different languages. It's hard to understand why there's so many.
Yeah, so I think the way programming languages work is more they're built for they're optimized for one kind of job. the idea behind like a program, like, Rust kind of language is designed for building low level systems that need like, high throughput in your system. So whereas like Solidity is really designed around like smart contract and EVM executions. So it's really just designed for that kind of use case. So all these languages have like a particular use case, and there was a need that someone thought they should build something. Because at the end of the day, it's like bytecode, like it's zeros and ones. That's what a computer understands. But then as a human, like what's easier for us to tell like how to do what to do. So some things are kind of abstracted away, so we don't all run into the same problem. So if you're writing for EVM execution, some things are just kind of abstracted when you're writing Solidity. Those things are not done in Rust, because like Rust is a completely different language. So languages are just a mere way to like communicate, and they're like optimized for some use cases.
Brilliant answer. And that helps me make sense of it. So I appreciate you taking a moment here and just talking about some of that. I do want to spend time exploring one other concept. I want to talk about open source. I think, based on my experience interviewing so many different people, this is more than just an approach to technology and writing software. This is a philosophical lens by which people navigate the world. So you mentioned in your story there that you started researching, reading up on open source and became interested in it. Talk to us about what open source is. And if I'm right, like what is the philosophy here? What is it that attracts people like you to it?
Yeah, so open source is like a philosophy, right? Like open source is all about like building systems that are transparent. You're collaborating with the people, and then there's trust that you build with other collaborators on them. So it's kind of like, building a community that is interested in solving the same problem. And then they all have like, there's enough, financial incentive driving any of them. It's more like there's one problem they all want to solve, and then how can they all solve that problem together? So it's just like, smart, everyone trying to just all the brain power coming together to be like, this thing is broken, let's fix it. So it's like everyone taking an initiative of like collaborating around the globe and making things happen.
So if there's no profit motivation, what's the motivation?
I think making world a better place. That's what drives most people. Like, at least for me, like I want to, the code I write is probably running like millions of people. Like it's powering millions of systems every day. So that's what kind of makes me satisfied every day is like, because, like you can write proprietary code that's just running on like subset of people, or you can write code that maybe potentially is running on code that's on Mars. So that's kind of, cool thing to see like, hey, you're just making a difference in the world,
That's an incredible answer. I totally see that. So another question I've asked when I've talked to people about open source is, open source came along before Web3. Do you see it as like a precursor, like this philosophy about software predating Web3, but maybe being like a necessary first domino or one of the first dominoes that kind of had to fall in order for Web3 to emerge? I mean, have you ever thought about the history and sequence of all this?
Yeah, open source has been there since like, since computers were a thing. Like, because early on when computers were developed, like it was very proprietary thing. Like not everyone could do things. And that's what like, some project decided to do is like, what if people can write code and like, what if we could do this? It was not proprietary. That's like, I think that's how Linux core was kind of developed. But then if I think about like this whole history is like Web3 has all these, philosophical commonalities between like open source and like what open source is all about. Like if you think about like how Web3 is like, we're talking about like, decentralization, right? Like decentralization not just means like decentralization of like running the infrastructure, or like running the code you interact, but like also ownership. At the Graph, like that's a pretty good example. Like we have 7 core dev teams, right? So the ownership is not just one company behind it. It's like group of people behind it, right? So I think decentralization is a great example. Like, when building systems, usually people, I think, end up at like decentralization on like one aspect of like interacting with the system, but they're forgetting about like who's running this, right? So if there's like one entity running this, it's not fully decentralized because they still control everything. So like ownership is like, I think decentralized ownership is like a biggest thing in Web3. And that's what like powers like open source itself. Because in open source, like there's no one owner about anything. It's like a group of people who collaborate and like they vote on things. we're talking about like, censorship resistance, like it's a big term in like Web3 too, and like in open source, right? Like if we're talking about like building something, like, the censorship is more like the rules that the community decides. It's the code of conduct that communities make. And that's the similar thing we do in Web3. And then we all welcome anyone to contribute. And that's, the philosophy in Web3 and also in open source. So I think that like, pretty much aligns with everything that open source does. Like Web3 has all those, features, but then Web3 is taking it the next step to like, how can we build a world like, everyone's trying to build like this whole permissionless system that anyone can interact with, anyone can build on it, and then it's transparent. Because prior to this, like transparency is like you are not owning your own data. I think that's the biggest thing that kind of sparked Web3 is like, how can we make it that you own your own data? I think Lens protocol is a great example. Like they just built a protocol for like, social discovery. And now there are like many different apps. So I'm not bound to just like one app. I can use any app I want. I can take my data with me. I think that's like the big difference that Web3 brings to the whole world.
I want to double click on that if you're willing, because I think people understand this idea of data ownership to a certain extent, but not in depth enough to really appreciate what's going on here. So I'm going to explain kind of my understanding of it, and then using everything you just said there and all your experience, correct and fill in the gaps. But Web 2, I don't own my data because, Facebook does or some other Web 2 company, and they're able to sell that, use it for advertising, and that really becomes the center of their business model in their revenue streams. When it comes to Web 3, you're saying that I own my data and I can take it with me. How is that the case? I mean, when I'm using Lens or I'm using the graph or anything else, I'm still creating data, so to speak. I'm still creating a footprint. So how do I own that? And how am I able to kind of take that with me? Do you mind explaining that?
Yeah. So I think you gave like a great example of Facebook, like, right? Like Facebook is known for like censorship a lot, right? If you would post something in one country, may not be visible in another country. It's like the very common problem, like, and there's no answers you will get from that. And then if we take like this whole, like, the ownership part, like, if we're talking about Web3, like, yes, you're building on, let's say, Lens protocol. Lens protocol is just like the data you're putting out, it's out in the public. It's not running on like Facebook's computer that you don't have access. You're putting out like on Ethereum blockchain or like whatever the blockchain they're using, you're putting on a public ledger. And then all that data is, you can read it yourself. Like you don't need the graph. You can build your own version of the graph to read that data. The reason we exist is like we are trying to solve, we ran like people who built the graph, like we all saw the same issues, right? Like we can't build slow interfaces. If we're trying to build like the next generation of user products, it needs to be fast. It needs to be reliable, right? And then these are the things like when the graph started, it's like they saw this is an issue and we can't scale. So like for us, it's like we're trying to solve a problem so you don't have to solve it. But you're free to like, you can actually read all that data with the JSON RPC. You can you can run your own Ethereum node and read the data yourself from the Ethereum node. No one's stopping you doing that. In like a grand scheme of things, it's like not everyone will be able to just like do all that. You won't be able to give like an optimal experience to every user. So like, these products building on top are not like, hindrance. Anyone's free to just take that thing. Like, to summarize, it's like, your data is sitting publicly. Anyone can go read it. And then in the Web 2 world, all that data is behind like someone's private servers. You're not allowed to read that. I think that's the biggest ownership difference.
So let's go then back to your personal story. And eventually you take a very formal step and you go to work in Web3 and you go to work on the team at the Guild. As we've already said, you're still full-time in university. So this is probably something you're doing as a quote unquote part-time or side hustle. Although I know Web3 hours are incredible even for full-time students. I'm sure you're working all the time, but what was that first formal step and how did you get working with the Guild?
Yeah. So, like I was part of the GraphQL JS working groups. So I have interacted with Uri like a lot and just like, working groups and like talking to him. So I had interacted with Uri a lot of times. And then one day Uri just reached out to me. He was asking you want to work for the Guild? Let's get on a call and talk about it. I was like, sure, this sounds like a great opportunity. So I got on a call with Uri. he didn't knew much about me. I didn't knew much about what he was doing. So it was like, we both learned about each other. We both were kind of impressed. And so he was like, okay, I will support you, whatever you're doing. So, I wasn't really getting paid until that point. And then Uri came in and he was like, I want to support you for whatever you're doing because you're making a difference in the world. I was like, sounds great, like no one pays you for doing open source. Like doing what you love to do and someone's paying for you. Like that's just like, that's the best thing you can ask for. Because all I was doing is like, I was just trying to learn how to write, just write code and like learn, like maybe end up with an internship somewhere, but like internship kind like a job kind of walked in for me. So that was like really great. And then Uri was like, you're not kind of, you're free to explore all the other projects we have. Like at the Guild, we have like more than 20 projects in the GraphQL ecosystem. So it was like a great opportunity for me. I was like, there's a lot more that I can learn, like, take from really smart people. So here I am working at the Guild.
And longtime listeners will know that I had the opportunity to interview Uri Goldshtein for episode 50. So for anyone that wants to learn more about Uri, I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. In preparation for this interview, Saihaj, you shared that one of the first things you worked on with the Guild was GraphQL Yoga, an incredible way to get started. What is GraphQL Yoga?
Yeah, so GraphQL Yoga is a GraphQL server. In 2018, GraphQL Yoga was like, this project that most people were using because it was like very easy to use and like get your GraphQL server up and running in like 4 lines of code. And then 2 years passed by, the maintainers kind of dropped support for GraphQL Yoga. They're like, this project had like over 5,000 stars on GitHub. Like a lot of people were using this thing. There were like millions of downloads every week. And then this thing was kind of abandoned and like Uri wanted to fix this thing. And then Uri was like, do you want to help us out? I was like, sounds really fun problem. Because like, many people are just stuck on like, how can they move on with this thing? Because no one's getting answers because the maintainers kind of, they went on doing other things. So when we took on GraphQL Yoga, our goal was like, how can we make, building GraphQL servers easy for anyone to use? The goal was like, it needs to be something we will ourselves run in production and then something we can tell people running in production that you can use it, but then also like easier for beginners. I had to just think through like, how can I make a thing that's like, just 4 lines of code, but also like, not just like 4 lines of marketing, but like actually I would run in myself for like an actual product. So that's where like this whole kind of research started, like, what can we do? What's needed in like a production ready server? So I think there was like, I explored a lot about like different things running in the ecosystem. And then we have this, plugin system that we built in the time, like we still use it. It's Envelope. That's what I started working on. So GraphQL Yoga and Envelope like are the big things I kind of started to work on when I started at the Guild. And that's where I started doing things at the Guild. But then nowadays I maintain GraphQL CodeGen. I think CodeGen is like a really cool project that most people getting into GraphQL end up using, because the whole idea behind GraphQL is like, I ask for this data, and as a developer, like, how can I improve this experience of like building my application? So CodeGen kind of, it kind of fills in the gap for the developers. Like it improves the developer experience for like building on a GraphQL API. So that's what I do these days.
Hi, this is Saihajpreet Singh from the Guild. If my conversation with the GRTiQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTiQ Podcast.
Thanks for listening.
As most listeners know, the Guild is one of the core dev teams building the graph. For anybody that hasn't heard that Uri Goldshtein interview, and maybe this is their first introduction formally to someone with the Guild and what the Guild is, do you mind providing just a quick overview of who the Guild is, what they're working on as it relates to the graph?
So at the Guild, we're a group of open source developers. That's what, got us all together. We're a group of open source developers. We maintain a lot of projects in the GraphQL ecosystem. And then, we do like whatever we do is like open and public. We have a SaaS product that we're running today. It's all public. Anyone can use the SaaS offering, or they're free to just run that SaaS offering themselves. So we really believe in open source. That's what got us who we are today. And then what do we do at the Graph? We focus a lot on like developer tooling and like the developer experience building on the Graph, and like the experience, like, just interacting with the Graph, right? There are like other teams making ways to go subgraphs fast, reading the data on the blockchain faster. Like if you know about streaming fast, they're building like ways, how can we read the blockchain data faster? But like what we're trying to do is like giving you a way to read all that data that they stored in the database. So that's where the GraphQL layer comes in. So we add features to the GraphQL layer, like security things that we can do to improve the graph. But the other part is like, building subgraphs. Like a lot of people building on the graph are building subgraphs. So like, how can you like make a good developer experience for them? So we work on like, the CLI tooling or building dApps around the graph. Like the whole point using the graph is like, you can build a decentralized dApp, meaning like if one API goes down, you can use another API, right? So with multiple subgraphs running on multiple indexers, so we have this tool called the Graph Client. So Graph Client makes it easier for anyone to use the graph and like get all the features that we have to offer in the decentralized network.
Do you remember when you first became aware of the graph? You've done a good job talking about when you first became aware of GraphQL and open source, Solidity, all these different things. What about the graph? When did you first become aware of it?
It was the summer 2021, sometime in the summer. That's when I kind of like, when I was working with my friend on a project, we saw the same issue of like, how do you read the data in like a more reliant way? And like, so I don't have to do all the same plumbing, because I was like, it's either I have to build this thing or someone already thought of this problem and they built it. So that's how I, ran into what the graph is all about.
I think when people like myself come in contact with the graph and start getting deeper and deeper into how all of it works, sometimes there's this presumption because of the similar name graph, the GraphQL and the graph are related. But as I think you've articulated here, they're certainly not the same thing. And in fact, they're separate entirely. Do you mind just explaining how they relate to each other, how people are using the graph and then using this GraphQL thing, which is totally separate and lives in its own kind of world, if you will?
Yeah. So the graph is like, what we're trying to build at the graph is like, we're trying to, let's just say Google, like, we're trying to build like a system that like reads all the blockchains so we can aggregate all the different protocols across the internet. Because how blockchains work, they're not easy to read the data on. And then we're just making it easier for you to read the data. So we are just solving that problem for you. But then how GraphQL comes in is like, GraphQL is just like a language that's just easier for anyone to write. All the data we have at the graph, like where GraphQL is kind of the language that's used to read that data. Like the graph itself, like graph is trying to be the graph of like all the data of like public ledgers. Whereas like GraphQL is just like, how can we read all those public ledgers?
As a core dev team, the Guild is a member and a well-known member of the GraphQL community. But beyond that, the Graph community and the GraphQL community recently collided at GraphQL Conference 2023 in San Francisco. You recently attended that. What can you tell us about GraphQL Conference this year and what it was like to see the graph there for the first time formally?
It was actually the first ever GraphQL Foundation sponsored GraphQL Conference. So like our team worked day and night to make this event happen. Like the Graph was also a sponsor for this event, just like the Guild was the sponsor for the event. The Graph was also a sponsor for this event. There we have like, workshops from Kevin Jones. If he's a developer from Edge and Node, he gave a workshop like, how does the graph work? Like how to build a subgraph and like how to read from a subgraph. Like, so he did like a workshop on that. There is a YouTube video that I can share. And then we also had like, GraphQL meetup the same day where like Pedro talked about what the graph is all about and like what we're trying to do. So it's just like, the same thing, like what the graph is and like, what are we doing? So we answer like those questions to like, there were attendees from like all these big organizations. Cause like many companies are trying to get into like, the whole blockchain and like Web3 kind of ecosystem. As a graph, we're just providing APIs to read the blockchain data. So we're just like, like our tools help you read public ledgers. So that's basically like we're there to like tell them, hey, these are the tools we're building. And then if you kind of run into the same problem, you can use us instead of just trying to reinvent the wheel. Like you can just use what we built. it was a more educational thing for the graph to like, tell, hey, this is a thing that exists and you can use.
Was there any big news out of the GraphQL community during this? I mean, I know Uri gave 3 presentations. I think Dotan, another member of the guild team, had a presentation. I'm not sure if you did, so you'll have to forgive me and correct me if you did. But any big news or any exciting things come out of GraphQL Conference 2023?
Yeah, most of the guild was actually like, speakers, and we ran workshops there. And then I think the big news is like, so we announced a new GraphQL gateway that we're going to open source in coming months. This will be something we will also bring to like, the graph itself. This is a gateway. As we work with like, different clients at the guild, we learned like everyone's trying to solve the same problem. And then we decided like, we all don't need to like, just reinvent the same wheel or just copy the same code. Why not just make something that anyone can use? So that's what the Dotan's talk was all about. I'll share the link in, you can look up on the transcript notes, but he just talks about like, the problems people end up building, a GraphQL gateway, and like the problems every GraphQL gateway is trying to solve. And that those are things we just want to solve out of the box. So that was like, one of the biggest thing. The other one was like, I think it's a pretty big thing these days, like, composing different APIs together. That's what our tool GraphQL Mesh. So GraphQL Mesh and Graph Client are essentially same things, because what we're trying to do at the graph is like, if we're talking about like composing multiple subgraphs, we're talking about just composing different APIs. So we demoed like how GraphQL Mesh works and like how people can be using it. And then the graph workshop was a great example because people could see like this is being used in production, because a lot of people are kind of using the graph every day and like how they are using it. So it was overall like a great, educational thing.
Since the time you first became aware of the graph and have gone full-time in working with the guild as a core dev, what have you learned about the graph? Either its community, the other core devs, or even just the nature of the problem it's solving, like the importance of what the graph does for Web3. I mean, take us through that. What have you learned?
I think indexing itself is like a really big problem, because the data on the blockchain is like not something, if you're just trying to read, it's not easy to read. And then what we're trying to solve is like, how can we make it easy to read? And then this whole problem like blows up the scope of like, there are different blockchains that we want to support. We just don't want like, only Ethereum. We want like Solana or like other blockchains. So I think there's like a lot of complexity, because every blockchain is kind of different in how they operate. So there's like a lot of like, differences on how all these work. So like there's a whole problem space of like, there's like a lack of like, a specifications around like how you interact with blockchains. Because if it's like a completely new blockchain, it's like a completely different thing. So I think there's a lot of problem space that we get to solve on that most people don't really need to like, solve once we solve it, because we have solved most of these problems for you. Every core dev has a different purpose at the graph. Like our like what we're trying to do is like, how can we make the developer experience better? Like that's what we know like a lot about. Like, and like, we know a lot about APIs. So like, how can you interact with the APIs very efficiently? So that's what we're trying to solve. If we're talking about like streaming fast is like, they want to solve the indexing problem. How can we index the subgraphs really fast? And streaming fast, like this demo of like substreams is a new technology. The technology that the graph has been, they have been working on with the graph to like, make indexing faster. Like what it means in just the numbers is like a subgraph that used to take 2 to 3 months to sync from Genesis to like the head of the blockchain takes like 20 hours. So that's like, pretty big improvement. And then if we're talking about like graph ops is making it easier for like indexers running graph nodes around the globe, because the graph is about like building a decentralized network. And then how Edge Node comes in is like Edge Node is trying to build ways like, how can other developers explore what the graph has to offer? Or like, how can you interact? So they're doing a lot of like, many educational things, but also like building experiences that make it easier for developers to come on with the graph. And then Finex is a new core dev team on the graph. And Finex is providing the infrastructure that's needed to like, run. They help with all the support for all that infrastructure that's needed to like, index blockchains or even run blockchains. And then if you talk about semiotic is like, they do research, and then they do like a lot of like, they're finding ways like, how can we make our indexers get paid even better? Like, how can we make it more decentralized? So there are many problems we're trying to solve. And the goal at the end, our goal is like, building an ecosystem, building a community that's like, that thrives for a long time. And then we all are not like, here to stop any innovation. Like many of the ideas actually come from like, the Graph Forum, like people give a problem, like we're trying to solve all those problems. It's like very community driven.
Saihaj, I only have a few more questions for you before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. The first one I want to ask is just about how you balance your time. You're clearly still in university, and that's a very busy thing to be doing, but you're contributing a ton to GraphQL, to the Guild, to the Graph. How do you balance that time and make sure, you don't burn out?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it takes time. I kind of found some life hacks on like how to actually be successful in university, but still have a job that you can, keep doing things. It's more about like how you organize yourself. I think that's the biggest thing. Like I have a full schedule of like, this is a time block of this thing I need to get done. And like, I don't, I am pretty like, oriented on my calendar. Like if you see my calendar, like everything is dotted, like I need to get it done. And then I try to keep my weekends empty just so I don't, overwork. But there are some times like, I will still do some things, but like all my weekdays are like, my mornings are like, okay, I'm going to do some school things. Or like at night, I'm going to go do some school things. Because most of my school classes that I'm in, like they're all online. And then most of my deliverables are just like, doing assignments. So that kind of makes it easier for me to be doing other things and like, collaborating with other people. But then in terms of like, work-life balance, like, the Guild, always very like open about like, if I need a time off, just because I have other things happening in life, that's totally okay.
The second question I want to ask is about your father. So you mentioned that he was an early influence in you getting into technology. And I can tell just by the way you've talked a little bit about that relationship that you're probably close with your father. What does he think about the fact that you grew up and you're at university and it seems like you're pursuing a career in this novel emerging industry, Web3 and blockchain?
Yeah, he's really happy for what I'm doing. And like, he understands like, the things I'm trying to solve. And like, he's always supporting me, whatever I need. And like, I still ask him a lot of, because, there are many things he's good at, like for all the infrastructure needs. If I need to learn anything on like how these things work, I still go to him and ask him questions. So it's like, we still talk about like, how things work, and like he helps me around. And then I've explained him like how the graph works. So he's pretty excited to see like, what I do in the future and like where it all goes.
And that's actually a good segue into my final question, which is about your future. So you're young, you're still getting started in life in a lot of ways. You're going to be done with university soon. You're having a huge impact at the Guild and on the Graph, and got a lot of thought leadership and contributions in the GraphQL community. What is your future? What do you want to do with the rest of your life?
It's a great question. That's something I also end up thinking on the weekends. And that's something I'm still trying to figure out. Like, I think I want to keep continuing exploring like different problems. But I think there's like, within Web3, I think there's a lot of problems. Like, I see like user onboarding. Like if we're talking about like onboarding, like next billion people to Web3, right? Like, how can we make that happen? That kind of whole problem space kind of excites me about like, how can we make it easier for people to use Web3 products? Like, using Web3, I mean like, your data ownership. That's what I'm really talking about. Like, how can we make products and experiences for people to use the tools we have built in a way where they don't even have to think? Because most, like, let's just use like, you sign in with Google, like in normal Web2 world, you sign in with Google and things work. Like, how can we build that experience that where like you're using everything in your everyday life? So like my research, like what I'm trying to explore is like, what are things that we can change from like this Web2 world and use the Web3 world, like bring all that in without like, anyone having that huge leap of like learning MetaMask. I think that's like this whole problem space in crypto is not solved. And like, we need to kind of solve this problem. So I think this whole user onboarding is what I'm trying to see, like what in this space I can kind of do and then take it from there.
I guess I have one last question, but do you think we're getting better at that onboarding thing? Do you think that's a problem the industry's doing a good job of at least trying to address?
I think people know the problem. There are many projects I've seen and worked with like who are trying to, like solve this problem, but like we're not at a scale. I think we would know the answer in like a couple of years. I mean, these things, it's not like one day that's going to make a change. Like in next 3 to 4 years, we probably will see the impact of like how better, we got, because based on the adoption, because I think most people kind of today get scared off with like crypto's nothing but NFTs and a Ponzi scheme on coins. I think that's not the reality. And I can't change someone's mind, but like I want to see more products and like see what more useful things we can do with the crypto space.
Well, Saihaj, now we've reached a point where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. I'm very excited to hear your answers to these questions. This is something we introduced to the podcast to help listeners get to know the guest a little bit better. But also, a lot of these answers can help listeners learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life. So are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Yes.
The GRTiQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
Strategy Rules. It's a book. It's a book like it's from the top 5 CEOs. So I think it has a lot of learnings on like, because if we talk about like Microsoft, Apple, IBM, like they were revolutionaries in like the back in the day when this whole computing industry was starting. And then I think there are like a lot of learnings, like what they did. We're trying to solve the same problems 20 years later on like a different scale. So like just learning from them, I think this book kind of gives you insights on like how can we strategize and like build like, to do things.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I like the series Blacklist. I think it's like, it's just like, crime action kind of. I kind of watch crime action stuff. So that's what I recommend to people because I like this show a lot. This has a very fictional aspect of like world is run by like, group of powerful people. And then I think we see those kind of things happen today. I don't know how fictional it is and how non-fictional it is. But it's a good show, in my opinion, that people should watch.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
So it's PBX1 from Sidhu Moosewala. He's a Punjabi singer, and I like him a lot. So yeah.
What's the best life advice someone's ever given to you?
Be nice to everyone.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think other people have learned or know quite yet?
What one thing I've learned, I think crypto is not about NFTs. There's a lot more to NFTs in crypto. And I think that's one thing I've learned is like, there are more practical use cases, like, the examples I early on gave with like music space. I think there's a whole world of like, we can explore with just NFTs and like what we can build, which is just like unexplored territory. So if anyone thinks that crypto is NFTs and it's a Ponzi scheme, I think that's just a bad take. And there's like, you need to be open to learn a lot more new things.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Work smart, not and hard, but like work smarter. So yeah.
Based on your own life experience or observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
Yeah, I mean, working smart is like, like you can work hard all day long, but then you need to like, optimize for some things in your life. So I think if you can work smart, if you know how to delegate work or like how to ask for help, I think those are like big things. Like if you see like any of these big CEOs, like how did they become big? Is like they found people who were good at the problem, or like they found people who were more passionate. So if I don't know something, I'll probably go ask someone. I think that's like one thing that people should do more to be more successful.
And the final 3 are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
Ownership. This, decentralized ownership.
And the next one, if you're on X, formerly Twitter, you should be following?
You should be following me. So Singh_Saihaj. And then you should also follow the Graph and the Guild.
And the last one, complete this sentence. I'm happiest when?
I solve a problem which I have been steering for a very long time.
The GRTiQ 10.
After this, I show you how deep
Saihaj, thank you so much for joining me for the GRTiQ podcast. It was incredible to meet you and to hear a lot about your story. Good luck with the remainder of university. And if listeners want to learn more about you, stay in touch with some of the things you're working on, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
You can go to my website, sahaj.dev, or you can go to my GitHub. You'll find all my contact information there. You'll find all my projects on my website or on my GitHub. So feel free to reach out anytime. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ Podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ
Podcast. Roger that.